The Phoenicians built no massive empire, yet they reshaped the world more than any conqueror. They were the premier maritime traders of the ancient world, a small coastal civilization that wove a vast network of sea routes connecting distant cultures. Along these routes flowed not just goods like purple dye and glass, but ideas, technologies, and the very alphabet we use today. This video explores 30 specific trade routes that fundamentally altered the course of civilization. How did a people who never fielded a great army spread their influence across continents and millennia? What made their purple dye worth more than gold, and how did their ships carry the seeds of modern commerce? By the end, you will see how these pioneering mariners laid the foundations for the global economy we still navigate today. What kind of legacy can a civilization build without an empire? The oldest of all Phoenician trade routes began not with a grand fleet, but with a single precious resource, cedar wood. The port city of Byblos sat on the coast of modern-day Lebanon, surrounded by forests of towering cedar trees that no other land could match. Down the coast, the great civilization of Egypt had built a sprawling kingdom along the Nile, but it had almost no timber of its own. So Egyptian ships began sailing north to Byblos, and a connection was born that would last more than 2,000 years. Byblos sent cedar logs to Egypt for shipbuilding, temple construction, and palace roofs. The Egyptians prized this wood above all others, using it for the great solar boats buried beside the pyramids and for the massive doorways of the Temple of Ammon at Karnak. Along with the timber went fragrant resins and oils used in mummification and religious ceremonies, but the most revolutionary cargo from Byblos was papyrus. Sheets of this pressed reed became Egypt's primary writing material, and Byblos controlled much of its distribution. In fact, the very word Bible comes from the Greek name for this city, a lasting echo of its role as a center of record-keeping and scroll-making. What did Egypt send back in return? Gold from the Nubian deserts, fine linen, and art objects. But more importantly, Egyptian ideas traveled north on those same ships. Byblos absorbed religious concepts, architectural styles, and artistic motifs from the Nile Valley. The city built temples that mirrored Egyptian designs, and its rulers adopted Egyptian titles and burial practices. This cultural exchange was not one-sided. Egyptian scribes began using adaptations of the Semitic alphabet that eventually influenced their own writing systems. Byblos became a meeting ground where two worlds blended. Historians note that this route transformed Byblos from a simple fishing village into the most powerful city-state on the Phoenician coast. Its wealth came not from conquest but from being the essential link between Africa and Asia. The relationship between Byblos and Egypt set the pattern for all later Phoenician trade. Find a valuable resource that one region lacks, establish a reliable sea route, and let cultural influence follow the flow of goods. This first corridor of commerce proved that trade could build bridges far stronger than any army, and it left a legacy in stone and scroll that archaeologists still uncover today. What happened when the Phoenicians extended those routes even farther west, beyond the reach of Egyptian influence? That is where the story begins to change the entire Mediterranean world. The route from Tyre to Cyprus was short, barely 100 miles across open water, but its impact reached far beyond the distance traveled. Tyre, the rising power among Phoenician cities, looked west and saw an island covered in copper. In the Bronze Age, copper was the backbone of civilization. Mixed with tin, it produced bronze, the material that made stronger tools, sharper weapons, and more durable armor. Without copper, no army could stand, no farmer could clear land efficiently, and no artisan could craft lasting metalworks. Cyprus happened to sit on some of the richest copper deposits in the ancient world. The very name copper comes from the Latin word for Cyprus, a linguistic reminder of the island's central role. But the Cypriots lacked something the Phoenicians possessed in abundance, the precious purple dye extracted from murex sea snails. This dye, called Tyrian purple, was worth more than its weight in gold. It colored the robes of kings, priests, and the wealthiest elites across the Mediterranean. So a natural exchange emerged. Phoenician ships left Tyre laden with clay amphorae of purple dye, fine glass, and cedar timber. They sailed north across gentle summer winds and arrived on Cyprus within a day. There they traded their luxury goods for raw copper ingots, often shaped like ox hides to make them easier to stack and transport. The copper came back to Tyre, where skilled metalworkers turned it into bronze axes, spear points, and decorative items that were then traded even farther. This regular, reliable route did more than move goods. It pulled Cyprus into the Phoenician commercial orbit. Cypriot villages near the coast began to grow into towns, stimulated by the steady demand for copper and the influx of foreign products. The Phoenicians established trading posts and small settlements on the island. They introduced their alphabet, their religious practices, and their shipbuilding techniques. Local leaders adopted Phoenician styles of pottery and architecture. The island's urbanization accelerated because a steady stream of ships made communication and commerce predictable. What started as a simple supply line for a metal became the foundation of a shared culture. Cyprus never became a Phoenician colony the way some Western settlements did, but it became something equally important, a trusted partner in a network that spanned the sea. The copper from Cyprus helped fuel the growth of Tyre into a powerhouse, and the purple dye that flowed back gave Cypriot elites a taste for the finer things, tying their fortunes to the Phoenician trade system. This short crossing proved that even a modest distance could create profound change. If a 100-mile channel could reshape an entire island, what would happen when Phoenician ships sailed 1,000 miles or more? The island of Crete held a civilization that would learn from the east. While Tyre sent ships to Cyprus for copper, the city of Sidon looked farther west across open sea to the spectacular palaces of Minoan Crete. This route, stretching roughly 250 miles, became the first regular connection between the advanced cultures of the eastern Mediterranean and the blossoming world of the Aegean. Sidon was famous for two things above all: glass and ivory. The Phoenicians had perfected the art of glassmaking. They created translucent vessels, intricate beads, and small figurines that captured light in ways no other craft could. Their ivory work was equally prized. Skilled carvers transformed elephant tusks and hippopotamus teeth into delicate relief panels, ornate combs, and miniature sculptures. These goods were not merely decorative, they were tokens of a sophisticated culture, and the Minoans eagerly absorbed them. Phoenician ships arrived on Crete carrying glass vessels that glowed like captured sunlight and ivory plaques carved with scenes of animals and mythical creatures. The Minoans, who already had a vibrant artistic tradition, began incorporating these foreign elements into their own work. Minoan frescoes started featuring more intricate borders and patterns that closely resembled Phoenician ivory designs. Pottery shapes shifted, adopting the elegant forms of Sidonian glassware, but the most profound influence may have been invisible to the naked eye. The Minoans used a writing system that historians call Linear A, which has never been fully deciphered. Researchers suggest that some of its symbols show a clear resemblance to the early Phoenician alphabet. While the Minoan script was not a direct copy, the contact with Phoenician record-keeping appears to have inspired the islanders to develop their own system of writing. This exchange of ideas traveled both ways. The Minoans sent back raw materials like tin and silver, but they also exported their own cultural products such as sophisticated bronze tools and elegant pottery. This route from Sidon to Crete did more than move luxury goods. It served as a bridge between two great civilizations that had previously only known each other through rumor and the occasional shipwreck. For the first time, Eastern Mediterranean ideas flowed directly into the Aegean. The Minoans learned about organized trade networks, standardized weights and measures, and the power of a merchant fleet. The Phoenicians gained access to the mineral wealth of the Western Islands and a new market for their most exquisite crafts. But perhaps most importantly, this connection laid the groundwork for what came next. The Minoans passed on what they learned to the Mycenaean Greeks, who would later dominate the Aegean, and those Greeks would eventually borrow the Phoenician alphabet, adapting it into the script that became the foundation of Western writing. All of this began with a single route, a line of ships crossing the sea between Sidon and Crete, carrying not just glass and ivory, but the seeds of a cultural transformation. Where did the Phoenicians turn next once they had a foothold in the Aegean, Sardinia? That island became the prize that transformed a struggling outpost into a superpower. While Tyre and Sidon focused on the Aegean, a new city in the far west began to rise with ambitions of its own. Carthage, founded as a small trading station around the late 9th century before the Common Era, lay on the coast of modern Tunisia. From its harbors, Carthaginian ships sailed northwest across the Sardinian Sea to an island that glittered with hidden wealth. Sardinia possessed some of the richest silver and lead deposits in the entire Mediterranean. The silver was crucial for coinage and luxury goods, but the lead served an even more essential purpose. It was used in shipbuilding and plumbing, and it helped extract silver from other ores. For a merchant republic like Carthage, controlling access to these metals meant controlling the economy of the Western Sea. The route from Carthage to Sardinia was relatively short, roughly 150 miles, and it became the backbone of Carthaginian power. Fleets of round-hulled merchant ships known as goloi made the crossing regularly, their holds filled with Carthaginian pottery, cloth, and the famous purple dye. They returned laden with ingots of silver and lead, some of which were stamped with the mark of the city. This steady flow of precious metal allowed Carthage to mint its own coinage, pay its armies, and outbid rivals for loyalty and resources. The silver financed a navy that would one day challenge even the might of Rome. But Carthage did not stop at simple trade. The city established permanent colonies along the southern and eastern coasts of Sardinia, places like Nora, Tharos, and Sulci. These settlements were not just trading posts, they became fully functioning towns with temples, harbors, and defensive walls. The native Nuragic people who had lived on the island for centuries found their world changing rapidly. Some communities welcomed the newcomers and entered into alliances, sharing in the profits of the metal trade. Others resisted, and over time the Phoenician presence reshaped the island's political map entirely. As Carthage's influence in Sardinia deepened, it inevitably collided with other powers. The Etruscans, who controlled much of mainland Italy to the north, had their own designs on Sardinian resources. The Etruscan cities were wealthy and ambitious, and they viewed Carthage's expanding foothold as a direct challenge. Soon the two civilizations found themselves competing for control of the same mines and harbors. When Greek colonists from cities like Phocaea began settling along the French and Spanish coasts, they too cast their eyes on Sardinia. This three-way rivalry led to a series of shifting alliances and open confrontations at sea. Carthage, with its seasoned navy and deep reserves of silver, managed to hold its ground. By the 5th century before the Common Era, Carthage had effectively secured its dominance over the southern half of Sardinia, while the Etruscans and Greeks were pushed to the northern margins. This did not happen without cost, but the Carthaginians understood that controlling Sardinia was not just about metal, it was about controlling the gateway to the entire western Mediterranean. The island became a fortress, a source of wealth, and a launching point for further expansion. And as Carthage grew stronger, it began to look beyond Sardinia toward even richer lands to the west. What waited there that would draw these determined merchants into yet another conflict with a rising power? The route from Gades to the Cassiterides was the most daring and secretive of all Phoenician voyages. Gades, modern-day Cadiz, sat on the Atlantic coast of Iberia, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the gateway to the unknown ocean. From this outpost, Phoenician captains pushed north into waters no Mediterranean sailor had ever dared to navigate. Their destination was a cluster of islands the Greeks called the Cassiterides, the Tin Islands, thought by modern scholars to be either the coast of Brittany or the distant shores of Britain. Bronze, the alloy that forged the weapons and tools of the ancient world, required two metals, copper and tin. While copper was relatively common in Cyprus and Sardinia, tin was far more scarce. Without tin, bronze could not be made. Civilizations that relied on bronze faced a crisis if their supply lines were cut. The Phoenicians understood this vulnerability better than anyone. They had scoured the known world for tin, finding small deposits in Iberia and along the Atlantic coast of France, but the richest source lay beyond the reach of any competitor. The Cassiterides held tin in abundance, but reaching them required crossing the open Atlantic, 1,000 miles of unpredictable winds, powerful currents, and fog-shrouded horizons. The Phoenicians mastered this challenge through generations of accumulated knowledge. They learned to read the stars at night, to follow the flights of seabirds, and to sense changes in weather by the taste of the air. Their ships, the sturdy goloi, were designed for the open ocean, with broad hulls that could carry heavy loads of ore and strong sails that could withstand Atlantic gales. They navigated by hugging the coast of Iberia, stopping at small fishing villages for fresh water and supplies, then crossing the Bay of Biscay to reach the tin-bearing shores. Once there, they traded with local tribes, exchanging fine pottery, glass beads, and wine for ingots of the precious metal. The Phoenicians guarded this route with fierce secrecy. They told fantastical stories to deter rivals, claiming the Tin Islands were guarded by sea monsters and that the waters were so shallow that ships could only move with oars. They even went so far as to sink their own ships rather than let competitors learn the navigational secrets. This monopolistic control of the tin supply gave the Phoenicians and later their Carthaginian descendants enormous leverage. Bronze-making civilizations from Greece to Etruria depended on Phoenician merchant houses for their most essential material. If a city-state angered the Phoenicians, the flow of tin could be slowed or stopped, crippling its military and economy. But the impact of this route went far beyond raw economics. The regular contact between Phoenician sailors and the peoples of Atlantic Europe introduced new technologies and ideas to regions that had been largely isolated. Local tribes learned improved methods of metalworking, shipbuilding, and trade organization. They began producing their own bronze goods for export, integrating into a network that stretched from the Atlantic to the Levant. This route also marked the beginning of long-distance Atlantic commerce, a system that would eventually connect the Mediterranean to the British Isles and beyond. The tin trade did not just supply bronze, it reshaped the entire economic geography of Europe. For the first time, the far western edge of the continent became a vital node in a global network. The Phoenician mastery of Atlantic navigation opened a door that would never be closed again. And with that door open, what other distant shores might these bold mariners reach? Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Phoenicians discovered a land that would become their greatest source of wealth. The route from Tyre to Tarshish was the most lucrative long-distance voyage in the entire ancient world. Tarshish, which most scholars identify with the region of Tartessos in southern Spain, lay on the Atlantic coast beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. This was not a small island or a single port, but a vast area rich in mineral deposits that seemed almost inexhaustible to Mediterranean eyes. The Rio Tinto River, whose name means Red River, ran through hills stained with copper and silver ore. The surrounding mountains held veins of iron, tin, lead, and gold. For the Phoenicians, this was the ultimate prize. The journey from Tyre to Tarshish covered nearly 2,500 miles. A typical voyage took several months, following the coast past Cyprus and Crete, across the open sea to Sicily and Sardinia, then along the North African shore to the Pillars of Hercules. Beyond that rocky gateway, the Atlantic opened wide and the final leg followed the Iberian coast south to the mouths of the Guadalquivir and the Tinto rivers. The Phoenicians established a permanent settlement at the site of modern Huelva and built the trading post that would later become Gades. From these footholds, they extracted the mineral wealth of the region on an industrial scale. The silver from Tarshish was legendary. It flowed eastward in staggering quantities. One ancient source describes Phoenician ships returning from Tartessos with so much silver that their anchors were replaced with silver ones because the lead originals had worn out. Whether that story is literally true or not, it captures the scale of the bounty. This silver did not simply sit in Tyrian treasuries. It was melted down, refined, and minted into coins that became the standard currency of the Eastern Mediterranean. It was traded to Egypt, to Assyria, to the Greeks, and to distant kingdoms in Anatolia and Mesopotamia. Iron and gold also came from Tarshish in significant amounts. The iron was essential for weapons and tools as the Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age. The gold adorned temples and palaces, and it was crafted into jewelry that rivaled anything produced in the older civilizations of the Nile or the Euphrates. Together, these metals transformed Tyre from a prosperous merchant city into a true imperial power. The city built monumental architecture that astonished visitors from across the known world. Tyrian craftsmen constructed a great temple to the god Melkart, covered in gold and silver, with massive bronze columns that could be seen from ships approaching the harbor. The city's walls rose to towering heights, its harbors were lined with stone quays and warehouses, and its markets overflowed with goods from 3 continents. The biblical references to Tarshish highlight just how deeply this place entered the cultural imagination. The prophet Ezekiel described Tyre trading with Tarshish, exchanging silver, iron, tin, and lead for the city's manufactured goods. The Book of Kings records that King Solomon of Israel and King Hiram of Tyre sent joint expeditions to Tarshish, returning with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. The phrase "ships of Tarshish" became a symbol of long-distance trade and unimaginable wealth. In the Book of Jonah, the prophet tries to flee from God by boarding a ship bound for Tarshish, using the destination as a metaphor for the farthest edge of the known world. Tarshish represented the ultimate horizon of Phoenician enterprise, a place where ordinary rules seemed to bend and where fortunes could be made in a single voyage. The impact of this route on Tyre itself was profound. The steady inflow of precious metals allowed the city to pay tribute to powerful neighbors like the Assyrian Empire without collapsing. It funded diplomatic gifts that bought peace and political influence. It attracted skilled artisans and merchants from across the region who wanted to share in the prosperity. Tyre grew into a city of perhaps 40,000 people, enormous by ancient standards, with a cosmopolitan population that included Phoenicians, Egyptians, Greeks, and peoples from the African coast. The wealth of Tarshish built the temples, the palaces, the harbors, and the defensive walls that made Tyre nearly impregnable. When the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V besieged the city in the 8th century before the Common Era, he could not take it. The sea routes kept Tyre supplied, and the silver from Tarshish kept its treasury full, but there was a cost. The mining operations in southern Iberia left permanent scars on the landscape. Ancient slag heaps, the waste from smelting vast quantities of ore, still dot the hills around the Rio Tinto. The forests that once covered the region were cut down to fuel the furnaces. The native Tartessian people who had lived in the area for centuries saw their culture transformed, absorbed, or displaced by the presence of their powerful trading partners. The relationship between Tyre and Tarshish was not equal. It was a colonial extraction economy, one of the earliest examples in European history. Yet for the Phoenicians, Tarshish was worth every risk. The route held together a commercial empire that spanned the entire Mediterranean and reached into the Atlantic. When Tyre eventually fell to Alexander the Great in the 4th century before the Common Era, the loss of Tarshish and its western routes was one of the final blows. The city that had thrived on Atlantic silver could not survive without it. The name itself lingered for centuries, becoming a legend in the ancient world, a byword for distant riches and the daring that was required to reach them. Where else did those ships of Tarshish travel, and what other treasures did they bring back from the edges of the world? Sidon's ships sailed for Rhodes carrying more than cargo. While Tyre poured its energy into the Atlantic and the western metals, the older city of Sidon turned its attention to the Aegean, and the island of Rhodes became its most important partner. The route from Sidon to Rhodes was not the longest, but it was one of the most strategic. Rhodes sat at the crossroads of the eastern Mediterranean, where ships from Egypt, Cyprus, and the Levant converged before venturing north toward Greece or west toward Crete and beyond. The Rhodians were skilled sailors themselves, but they lacked the deep commercial networks and the luxury goods that Sidon produced in abundance, so a natural partnership took shape. Sidonian merchants filled their holds with purple fabric, glass vessels, carved ivory, and cedar timber. They sailed west along the coast of Cyprus, then across open water to the northern shore of Rhodes, landing at the city of Ialissos or the main harbor of Rhodes town. There they offloaded their wares, and the Rhodians re-exported them throughout the Aegean archipelago to the islands and the mainland of Greece. This re-export trade was not merely a convenience. It transformed Rhodes into a wealthy entrepot, a place where goods from the east could be sorted, repackaged, and sold at a profit. The Rhodians became expert middlemen, learning the Phoenician methods of accounting and record-keeping to manage the flow of merchandise. But the cargo that had the most lasting impact was not physical at all. Along with the goods came two invisible forces: shipbuilding techniques and writing. The Phoenicians had perfected the art of constructing ships that were faster, more stable, and more capacious than any other vessels in the Mediterranean. Their hulls used mortise and tenon joinery, creating a flexible yet strong structure that could withstand rough seas. The Rhodians watched, learned, and soon began building their own ships using Phoenician methods. Over time, they improved on the designs, creating the sleek warships and sturdy merchant vessels that would later make Rhodes a naval power in its own right. But the more profound gift was the alphabet. The Phoenicians wrote with a system of 22 symbols that represented consonants, a radical simplification compared to the hundreds of signs used in Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform. This made literacy far more accessible. On Rhodes, Greek merchants and scribes encountered this elegant script and recognized its potential. They adapted it to their own language, adding symbols for vowels which the Phoenician system had lacked. The result was the Greek alphabet, the direct ancestor of the Latin alphabet we use today. This adaptation did not happen overnight. It took decades of contact with Greek speakers experimenting and modifying the letters to fit the sounds of their tongue. The Phoenician letter Aleph became Alpha, Bet became Beta, and the very word alphabet is a combination of these first two letters. The impact was revolutionary. Literacy, which had once been the domain of a small class of scribes and priests, began to spread across the Greek world. Ordinary people could record contracts, write letters, and carve public inscriptions. Poetry, philosophy, and history could be written down and shared. The Homeric epics, previously passed down through oral tradition, were transcribed into this new script. The rapid spread of literacy fueled the intellectual ferment of the Greek city-states, the same ferment that would eventually produce democracy, drama, and scientific inquiry. None of that would have been possible without the Phoenician alphabet carried by Sidonian merchants to Rhodes. The route from Sidon to Rhodes did not just move goods, it moved the building blocks of Western culture. And once those blocks were laid, the entire structure of ancient knowledge began to rise. Aradus, a tiny island city, held a secret that would change the ancient world. Perched just off the Syrian coast, its twin harbors were crowded with ships bound for the interior of Anatolia. There, on the high plains of what is now modern Turkey, the Hittite Empire had built a civilization around a metal that was still rare in the lowlands: iron. The route from Aradus to the Hittite heartland was short by Phoenician standards, barely 200 miles as the crow flies, but it traversed a landscape of rugged mountains and swift rivers. The first leg was a coastal voyage north to the mouth of the Orontes River. From there, goods were transferred to donkey caravans that climbed the passes of the Taurus Mountains, winding through narrow gorges and past ancient fortresses. The journey was slow and dangerous, but the cargo made it worthwhile. Aradus sent north what the Hittites desperately needed: cedar timber for construction and shipbuilding, and finely woven textiles dyed with the purple that only Phoenician cities could produce. The Hittites, masters of the dry Anatolian plateau, had little access to good building wood and no source of the murex snail that yielded the royal dye. In exchange, they offered their most prized resource, iron. The Hittites had perfected the smelting of iron ore, creating a metal that was harder, more durable, and more abundant than bronze. At first, iron was treated as a luxury, nearly as valuable as gold. Hittite kings controlled its production with fierce secrecy, and they used it as a diplomatic gift to seal alliances. But the regular trade with Aradus changed that. Phoenician merchants brought in not just timber and textiles, but also technical knowledge. They introduced new methods of charcoal production and furnace design that made iron smelting more efficient. By the 12th century before the Common Era, the Hittite monopoly on iron was breaking down. The metal began to flow south in increasing quantities, not as a rare curiosity, but as a trade good. The Phoenicians were instrumental in spreading iron across the eastern Mediterranean. From Aradus, the ingots traveled by sea to Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon, where they were forged into tools and weapons by skilled craftsmen. Plowshares made of iron could cut deeper into hard soil, boosting agricultural yields. Axe heads lasted longer and could fell trees faster. And iron swords, when properly forged, could shatter bronze blades, giving any army that carried them a decisive advantage. This shift had profound consequences. The old Bronze Age powers that had dominated the Near East, the Egyptians, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites themselves, found their world unraveling. Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, a wave of upheaval swept the region. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse, and its causes are still debated. But one factor was clear: the widespread availability of iron leveled the playing field. Small states and migrant groups that had never before possessed advanced weaponry could now arm themselves with iron. The old order crumbled and new powers rose from the ashes. The Phoenicians, with their established trade networks and access to iron, weathered the storm better than most. Their cities along the coast remained intact while inland empires fell. Aradus, in particular, grew wealthy by supplying both the metal and the finished goods to whoever could pay. The route from Aradus to the Hittite interior did not just move metal, it accelerated the arrival of a new age. The Iron Age, as scholars call it, was not a sudden invention but a slow, cumulative transformation. And the Phoenicians were its couriers. They carried the raw material and the knowledge from the Anatolian highlands to the docks of the Levant, and from there to the entire Mediterranean world. By the time the Hittite Empire itself had faded into history, the iron trade that began on this route had changed how people farmed, fought, and built. The secret that Aradus helped unlock would never be sealed again, and as the Iron Age dawned, the Phoenicians found themselves standing at the center of a new world, one that would demand even greater voyages and more daring trade. Carthage turned its gaze west toward mountains that bled silver. While the eastern Phoenician cities had grown wealthy on the copper of Cyprus and the tin of the Atlantic, the rising Republic of Carthage saw a different prize shimmering in the Iberian Peninsula. The Sierra Morena Range, a rugged spine of hills stretching across southern Spain, held some of the richest silver deposits ever discovered in the ancient world. The veins ran deep and pure, and the native Iberian tribes had only scratched the surface with their primitive tools. Carthaginian merchants and military leaders recognized an opportunity that could fund an empire. So they established a regular sea route along the Iberian coast, hugging the shoreline from their base at Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, all the way to the mouth of the Guadalquivir. On this route, ships carried not only trade goods but also engineers, miners, and administrators who would transform the region into a vast industrial operation. The Carthaginians introduced advanced mining techniques. They dug vertical shafts, built drainage tunnels, and used slave labor on a massive scale to extract the ore. At its peak, the silver production from the Sierra Morena may have reached several million ounces per year, an almost incomprehensible sum for the ancient world. This silver did not stay in Iberia. It flowed eastward in the holds of Carthaginian merchant vessels, destined for the treasuries of North Africa and beyond. And it flowed back into the western Mediterranean in the form of warships, mercenary armies, and fortified trading posts. One of the most important of these was Acre Luke, which means the White Mountain or the White Fortress, a settlement that grew into the modern city of Alicante. Acre Luke sat on a rocky promontory overlooking a natural harbor, perfectly positioned to control the coastal trade and to defend against rivals. It became a major center for the storage and transshipment of silver, as well as a hub for Carthaginian political influence over the Iberian tribes. The Carthaginians did not simply extract resources. They integrated local leaders into their commercial network, offering access to Mediterranean markets in exchange for loyalty and labor. Iberian chieftains adopted Carthaginian styles of dress and weaponry, and they began minting their own coins modeled on Carthaginian designs. The balance of power in the Western Mediterranean shifted dramatically. The silver from Iberia allowed Carthage to rebuild its navy after defeats, to hire skilled mercenaries from Gaul and Numidia, and to fund the long series of conflicts with Rome that historians call the Punic Wars. Without the Iberian silver, Carthage could never have sustained those decades of warfare. It was the financial engine that kept the Republic running, even as its armies marched across Sicily, Sardinia, and Italy. The Romans understood this perfectly. When they finally broke Carthaginian power, their first major objective was to seize control of Iberian silver mines. They knew that cutting off that flow of wealth would starve Carthage into submission, and it did, but the legacy of this route extended far beyond military history. It created the first truly integrated economic zone in the Western Mediterranean, linking North Africa, Iberia, and the islands into a single commercial system. The cities along the Iberian coast, from Gades to Carthago Nova to Acre Luke, grew prosperous and cosmopolitan. They became gateways where African ivory, Spanish silver, Italian wine, and Greek pottery all changed hands. The cultural fusion that resulted left a permanent mark on the region, visible in the art, architecture, and language of later Roman Spain. Where would Carthage turn next with its newfound wealth, and what other frontiers awaited its merchants and its armies? Along the coast of modern Lebanon, 3 cities once formed a rare alliance. They called themselves Tripolis, meaning 3 cities, and they functioned as a confederation where Aradus, Sidon, and Tyre each maintained their own quarter. This unique arrangement turned Tripolis into a meeting ground where the major Phoenician powers could coordinate their maritime efforts. From its twin harbors, a steady flow of ships set sail for the island of Cyprus, just 100 miles across open water. The route was short but vital, and the cargo traded along it tells us something important about how the Phoenician world held together. The ships leaving Tripolis carried 3 staples that the mountainous interior of Cyprus could rarely produce in quantity: fine pottery, pressed olive oil, and aged wine. The pottery came from workshops along the Levantine coast, painted with geometric designs and delicate floral patterns that were prized by Cypriot households. The olive oil was stored in large clay amphorae, one of the most important commodities of the ancient Mediterranean, used for cooking, lighting, and anointing the body. The wine, often sweetened with honey or spices, was a luxury that Cypriot elites craved for their feasts and religious ceremonies. On the return voyage, the same ships filled their holds with copper ingots from the rich mines of the Troodos Mountains. That copper, shaped into oxide form, was the raw material that fueled the bronze industry of the entire region. But this exchange was about more than goods. The regular traffic between Tripolis and Cyprus strengthened something invisible yet powerful, a shared sense of Phoenician identity. The sailors and merchants who made the crossing came from different city-states, but they lived together in Tripolis, worked together on the docks, and faced the same storms at sea. They spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, and understood that their prosperity depended on cooperation, not competition. The route to Cyprus became a symbol of that unity. When a ship from Aradus docked in Cypriot harbors, its crew might carry cargo that included pottery from Sidon and wine from Tyre. The islanders saw them all as Phoenicians, not as citizens of separate cities. This sense of common purpose was reinforced by the way the Confederation operated. Tripolis had a council where representatives from each city discussed matters of trade, defense, and diplomacy. They negotiated with foreign powers as a bloc, presenting a united front that no single city could have maintained alone. The Cyprus route was one of their most carefully managed assets, ensuring that all three cities shared equally in the profits. If a merchant from Tyre tried to undercut a Sidonian competitor on the island, the council would step in to mediate. The result was a maritime alliance that lasted for centuries, long after the great empires of the interior had risen and fallen. Historians note that this collaboration helped the Phoenician cities survive the turbulence of the Iron Age. While many other civilizations fractured into warring states or fell to invaders, the Phoenician Confederation held together precisely because of routes like the one to Cyprus. The trade in pottery, wine, and oil for copper was not just an economic exchange. It was a thread that wove the city-states into a fabric strong enough to withstand external pressure. Every voyage that left Tripolis reminded the sailors that they belonged to something larger than a single port. And every ingot of Cypriot copper that arrived on the Levantine shore represented a bond between islands and mainland that would endure for generations. That bond, forged in the holds of humble merchant vessels, would prove to be one of the Phoenicians' greatest strengths. It allowed them to project power not through armies but through networks, and it ensured that even when one city faced hardship, the others could keep the trade flowing. The route from Tripolis to Cyprus did not simply move goods, it moved trust, and trust in the ancient world was the most valuable cargo of all. North of Carthage, the port of Utica prepared its ships for a crossing that would change the face of an island. Utica was one of the oldest Phoenician settlements on the African coast, older even than Carthage itself. From its sheltered harbor, vessels set sail for the western shores of Sicily, a fertile land that had long been a patchwork of native tribes and scattered Greek colonies. The distance was modest, less than 150 miles, but the cargo those ships carried was not measured in ingots or dyed cloth. It was measured in cuttings and seeds. The Phoenicians brought with them something more valuable than any luxury good: the knowledge of how to cultivate olives and grapes on a commercial scale. Sicily had wild olives and native vines, but the local inhabitants had never developed the techniques for pressing oil or fermenting wine in the quantities that Mediterranean trade demanded. Phoenician settlers from Utica and Carthage introduced improved terraced farming, the careful pruning of trees, and the art of pressing olives under heavy stone wheels. They planted vineyards on the sunny slopes of western Sicily, training the vines on trellises and harvesting the grapes at just the right moment for the sweetest wine. Within a few generations, the island began to produce its own olive oil and wine, not just for local consumption but for export. The economy of western Sicily shifted from subsistence farming to commercial agriculture. Surplus oil and wine filled ceramic amphorae and traveled back to Utica, to Carthage, and onward to markets across the Mediterranean. This transformation attracted more Phoenician settlers. They established small trading posts at natural harbors along the coast, places like Motia, a tiny island just off the western tip of Sicily, and Panormus, the site of modern Palermo. These settlements were not large cities at first. They were fortified storehouses and docks where agricultural products could be collected, processed, and shipped. But over time, they grew into thriving communities. The Phoenicians built temples to their gods, constructed houses of stone, and surrounded their towns with walls. They intermarried with local Sicilian families, blending customs and languages, and then the Greeks arrived. Greek colonists from the eastern part of the island pushed westward, attracted by the same fertile lands. Instead of fighting constant wars, the two cultures often mixed. The Phoenician trading posts, sites like Soluntum and Motia, gradually adopted Greek architectural styles, Greek pottery, and the Greek language. They became what historians call Hellenized cities. Their public buildings featured Greek columns, their markets sold Athenian vases, and their citizens spoke a dialect that blended Phoenician and Greek words. Yet the agricultural roots remained. The olive trees and grapevines that the Phoenicians had planted continued to bear fruit for centuries. Sicily became famous throughout the ancient world for its oil and wine, a reputation that lasted well into Roman times. The route from Utica to Sicily did not just move goods, it planted the seeds of an agricultural revolution. The hillsides of western Sicily still carry the terraces that Phoenician farmers first carved into the slopes, a quiet monument to the knowledge that crossed the sea in the hold of a merchant ship. And those trading posts, transformed by time and contact, became the foundations of cities that endure to this day. Down the Nile, the city of Memphis drew Phoenician ships like a magnet. This ancient capital of Egypt sat at a crucial crossroads where the great river split into its delta channels, making it a natural hub for trade from both the Mediterranean and the interior of Africa. The route from Tyre to Memphis was not a single straight line. It began with a coastal voyage south along the Levantine shore, past the sands of the Sinai Peninsula, until the ships reached one of the eastern mouths of the Nile. There they had to transfer their cargo to smaller river vessels, nimble boats that could navigate the shifting currents and shallow sandbars of the delta. The journey upriver against the gentle flow of the Nile took several days, passing through lush farmland, past villages of mud brick, and beneath the shadow of pyramids that had stood for more than 1,000 years. What did the Phoenicians bring to Memphis? They carried the finest products of their workshops, bolts of cloth dyed in that unmistakable Tyrian purple, beads and vessels of translucent glass, carved ivory panels, and chests of fragrant cedar wood. These were not everyday items, they were luxury goods intended for the palaces of pharaohs, the storehouses of temples, and the tombs of the elite. Egyptian nobles prized Phoenician craftsmanship above all others, and they were willing to pay handsomely in gold, linen, and grain. But the exchange went deeper than simple commerce. Phoenician artisans skilled in metalworking and ivory carving were invited to work directly in Egyptian temples and royal workshops. They learned to adapt Egyptian motifs, the lotus flower, the scarab beetle, the winged sun disk, and they blended these with their own traditions. The result was a fusion of styles that scholars call Phoenician Egyptianizing art. This hybrid style did not stay in Egypt. It traveled back to Tyre and Sidon, where it was incorporated into luxury objects destined for markets across the Mediterranean. Small ivory plaques carved with sphinxes wearing Egyptian headdresses, metal bowls decorated with scenes of pharaohs hunting lions, intricate jewelry that combined Phoenician granulation with Egyptian symbols of protection. These objects have been found as far away as Cyprus, Crete, Sardinia, and even the Iberian Peninsula, carried by Phoenician merchants who understood that the prestige of Egyptian imagery added value to their goods. Religious ideas also crossed the water. Phoenician sailors and traders encountered the great gods of the Nile Valley, Isis, Osiris, Horus. They drew parallels with their own deities such as Melkart and Astarte. Over time, certain Egyptian religious practices, like the use of amulets and the concept of divine kingship, influenced Phoenician temple rituals. Back in Byblos, which had long been a conduit for Egyptian culture, the local goddess Baalat was often depicted with the horned headdress of the Egyptian goddess Hathor. The line between Egyptian and Phoenician belief grew blurred. Memphis itself was a city of wonders. Its great temple of Tyre, the creator god, housed colossal statues and towering pylons. Its markets overflowed with goods from Nubia, Libya, and the Red Sea. Phoenician merchants stationed there for weeks or months at a time, renting warehouses and forming partnerships with Egyptian traders. Some even settled permanently, marrying into local families and raising children who spoke both Phoenician and Egyptian. They became a community of intermediaries bridging two worlds. The route from Tyre to Memphis did more than move luxury goods. It created a corridor where artistic and religious ideas could flow in both directions. The ivories and metalwork that emerged from this fusion became some of the most coveted objects in the ancient world, carried by Phoenician ships to every corner of the Mediterranean. And those objects carried with them a little piece of Egypt, a distant echo of the Nile, embedded in the hands of a queen on Cyprus, a priest in Sardinia, or a warrior in Iberia. What other great river would the Phoenicians ascend next, bringing their goods and their gods with them? Byblos held dominion not only over the sea, but over the land routes that led east. While its harbor welcomed Egyptian ships, its gates opened onto a network of donkey caravans that climbed the steep passes of the Lebanon mountains and descended into the broad valley of the Bekaa. There, at the crossroads of the ancient world, the road forked. One branch swung north toward the great city of Aleppo on the plains of Syria. Another turned south and east, following the Barada River through a narrow gorge until it emerged into the oasis of Damascus, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. These overland routes were not easy. They required negotiating treacherous mountain trails, crossing swift rivers, and paying tolls to local chieftains who controlled the passes. But the cargo was valuable enough to justify the risk. From Byblos came massive beams of cedar, so long that they had to be dragged on sledges pulled by teams of oxen. The timber was destined for the palaces of Syrian kings and the temples of Mesopotamian cities like Nineveh and Babylon. Along with the wood went jars of pine resin, used as sealant for ships and as incense in religious rites, and amphorae of sweet wine, prized by the inland elites who could not get enough of the coastal vintage. In exchange, the caravans returned laden with Syrian silver. The mountains of Anatolia and the Taurus range produced silver in quantities that rivaled the mines of Iberia. This silver came in ingots or as finished vessels, and it flowed into Byblos, where it was melted down and minted into coins or crafted into jewelry. But the most spectacular return cargo was the horses. The dry plains of Syria and the highlands of Cappadocia bred some of the finest horses in the ancient world. They were tall, strong, and fast, perfect for chariot warfare and later for cavalry. Byblos became a major entrepot for the horse trade. On the docks of the city, Anatolian stallions were loaded onto ships bound for Egypt, where pharaohs paid enormous sums for mounts that could pull their war chariots. This trade integrated Byblos deep into the commercial networks of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian kings, who controlled much of Mesopotamia and Syria, demanded tribute and trade from the coastal cities. Byblos complied willingly. Its merchants established permanent trading quarters in Damascus and Aleppo, where they stored goods in walled compounds and negotiated with local traders who brought spices from Arabia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and copper from the mountains of Iran. The city became a vital link in a chain that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Through Byblos, Phoenician wares reached the heart of the Assyrian Empire, and Assyrian goods traveled west. The cultural exchange was equally significant. Aramaic, the language of Syria and Mesopotamia, began to appear in Byblos alongside the native Phoenician tongue. Inscriptions from the city show scribes writing in both scripts, adapting the Phoenician alphabet to record Aramaic documents. This blending of languages and scripts would spread across the Near East, eventually making Aramaic the lingua franca of the Persian Empire. The route from Byblos to the Levantine interior did not just move timber and horses, it knotted the coastal world to the landlocked empires. It turned a small harbor city into a gateway between sea and desert. And it ensured that the influence of Byblos would be felt not only on the waves, but on the dusty roads that led to the ancient cities of the East, where the echoes of its trade can still be found in the ruins of caravanserai and the foundations of palaces built with Lebanese cedar. Carthage looked west to a pair of islands that produced something far more valuable than silver. The Balearic Islands, lying off the coast of eastern Spain, held two resources that the growing republic needed desperately: expert fighters and abundant salt. The route from Carthage to these islands was a familiar one, following the North African coast westward and then cutting north across the open sea. The distance was manageable and the trade winds made the crossing predictable. But the cargo that Carthaginian ships carried on the return voyage was unlike anything they loaded in Iberia or Sardinia. The Balearic Islanders were famous throughout the ancient world for their slingers. From childhood, they trained with the sling, a simple but devastating weapon that could hurl a stone with enough force to crack a shield or fell a soldier at 100 paces. The islanders became so skilled that they rarely missed. Carthage, always in need of reliable mercenaries for its armies, established a regular system for recruiting these fighters. Young men from the islands would sign contracts, board Carthaginian ships, and sail off to serve in campaigns across Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa. In return, they received payment in goods and coin, much of which flowed back to their families and communities. The Balearic slingers became a staple of Carthaginian military power. They fought with distinction in the Punic Wars, and their reputation spread as far as Greece and Rome, but the trade in human skill was only part of the story. The Balearic Islands also possessed something that seemed ordinary but was essential to an empire built on fish, salt. The shallow coastal lagoons of the islands evaporated under the hot Mediterranean sun, leaving behind crusts of pure white salt. Carthaginian merchants recognized the value of this resource immediately. Salt was the key to preserving fish, and the waters around the Balearic Islands and the North African coast teemed with tuna and mackerel. Carthaginian fishermen developed methods for catching these fish in massive numbers, then salting and drying them aboard ship or in coastal processing stations. The result was a product that could be stored for months and shipped across the sea without spoiling. Salted fish became one of Carthage's most important exports, sold to cities that lacked easy access to the sea or needed a reliable food source for their armies and navies. The industry grew so large that it transformed the economy of the entire region. Carthaginian traders established fish processing plants along the coasts of Iberia, North Africa, and the Balearics themselves. They built concrete vats where layers of fish and salt were stacked and pressed, creating a fermented fish sauce called garum that was prized as a seasoning across the Mediterranean. Garum was not just a condiment, it was a luxury item traded as far as Greece, Egypt, and even the distant lands of the Black Sea. Roman gourmets would pay a fortune for high-quality garum, and Carthage controlled much of the supply. The route to the Balearic Islands thus served a dual purpose that made it indispensable. On one hand, it supplied the human capital that kept Carthaginian armies on the field. On the other, it provided the salt that fueled a vast industry feeding the cities of the Mediterranean. The islands themselves became prosperous through this trade, their harbors crowded with ships loading salted fish and unloading pottery, wine, and cloth. The people of the Balearics, once isolated from the mainstream of Mediterranean commerce, found themselves woven into a network that stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the ports of the Levant. Their slingers marched with Carthaginian generals, and their salt seasoned the meals of distant households. What began as a simple exchange of mercenaries for goods grew into a commercial relationship that shaped the diet and warfare of an entire civilization. And as Carthage looked beyond the Balearics, it began to realize that the sea held even more secrets waiting to be harvested. Sidon aimed its merchant fleet straight for the heart of Greece. While Carthage pushed westward toward the Atlantic islands, the old Phoenician cities kept their focus on the Aegean, and no destination mattered more than Corinth. The route from Sidon to Corinth was not the longest, but it was one of the most culturally explosive. Ships departed the Levantine coast and sailed west across open water, past Cyprus, past the southern tip of Crete, and then north into the narrow waters of the Saronic Gulf. There, on the isthmus that connected mainland Greece to the Peloponnese, Corinth sat like a gatekeeper between two seas. Its twin harbors, one facing west toward Italy and one facing east toward Asia, made it the natural clearinghouse for all trade entering and leaving the Greek mainland. Corinthian merchants understood their position perfectly. They controlled the Diolkos, a paved roadway built across the isthmus so that ships and cargo could be hauled overland, avoiding the dangerous circumnavigation of the Peloponnese. Any vessel carrying goods from the east had to pass through Corinth, and the city took its cut from every transaction. Sidonian merchants arrived in Corinth carrying two things that the Greek world had never seen in such quality. The first was purple cloth dyed with the precious secretion of the murex snail. To the Greeks, this color was not merely beautiful, it was otherworldly. They had no native source for such a deep, lasting purple, and the Sidonian fabric seemed to glow with an almost magical intensity. The second was perfume. Phoenician perfumers had perfected the art of extracting and blending scents from flowers, resins, and spices. They produced oils that could linger on the skin for hours, fragrances that evoked the exotic gardens of the East. These perfumes were stored in small glass bottles, themselves works of art that Corinthian women and men coveted as status symbols. In exchange, the Sidonians loaded their holds with Corinthian pottery. The black figure and red figure vases produced in Corinthian workshops were the finest in the Greek world. Their surfaces were painted with scenes from mythology, athletic competitions, and daily life, executed with a precision and liveliness that no other pottery tradition could match. These vases did not stay in Sidon. They were re-exported across the Phoenician network, carried to Cyprus, to Egypt, to Carthage, and even to Iberia. Greek artistic styles thus began to appear in distant lands, carried not by Greek traders but by Phoenician ships. But the most essential cargo that Sidon took from Corinth was timber. The mountains around Corinth were covered in dense forests of fir and pine, ideal for shipbuilding. Phoenician shipwrights needed vast quantities of timber to maintain their fleets, and the forests of the Levant had been heavily depleted by centuries of construction. Corinthian timber was straight-grained, strong, and abundant. It was cut into planks and beams, loaded directly onto Sidonian vessels, and shipped east to the shipyards of Tyre and Sidon, where it was shaped into the hulls of the next generation of merchant ships. The exchange went far beyond raw materials and finished goods. Greek elites who had long admired Eastern luxury from a distance could now acquire it directly. Corinth became the gateway through which Phoenician purple, perfume, and jewelry entered the Greek mainland. The wealthy citizens of Athens, Thebes, and Sparta began to dress in Sidonian fabrics, scent themselves with Phoenician oils, and decorate their homes with Levantine ivory and glass. Greek fashion shifted. The simple woolen garments of earlier centuries gave way to more elaborate styles, with borders dyed in purple and patterns influenced by Phoenician designs. Greek jewelry, which had been relatively plain, grew more intricate, incorporating granulation and filigree techniques learned from Sidonian goldsmiths. Athenian potters, who had long looked to Corinth for inspiration, began to imitate Phoenician motifs, adding lotus flowers, palmettes, and animal friezes to their vases. The result was a blending of traditions that historians call Orientalizing. a period when Greek art consciously absorbed and reinterpreted the styles of the East. Corinth itself was transformed by this ongoing exchange. The city grew fabulously wealthy, its temples and public buildings adorned with the finest materials. Its pottery industry boomed, supplying not just Sidon but markets across the Mediterranean. Its shipbuilders became renowned for their skill, and its merchants established trading connections that reached as far as the Black Sea. But the most profound impact was invisible to the naked eye. The regular contact between Sidon and Corinth created a channel through which knowledge flowed as freely as perfume. Greek travelers, traders, and artists visited Phoenician cities and brought back ideas about astronomy, mathematics, and shipbuilding. Phoenician merchants, living for months at a time in Corinth, learned to speak Greek, adapted their alphabet to write it, and carried those adaptations back east. The alphabet that reached mainland Greece had already been shaped by earlier contacts on Rhodes and Crete, but Corinth became the place where it truly took root. From Corinth, the adapted script spread to Athens, to Thebes, and to the rest of the Greek world. The purple and perfume of Sidon did not just change how Greeks dressed and smelled. They opened a doorway through which Eastern civilization poured into the heart of Hellas. And once that doorway was open, there was no closing it. The Minoan frescoes at Knossos still hold a vivid secret: Phoenician ships painted on palace walls. These images, preserved for nearly 35 centuries, are the clearest evidence of a maritime connection that predated classical Greece by half a millennium. The route from Tyre to Knossos was not the first Phoenician sea lane, but it may have been the most transformative for the future of Europe. From the wealthy port of Tyre, ships laden with treasures from distant continents set sail for the sprawling palace complex on Crete. The cargo they carried was unlike anything the Aegean had ever seen. Among the most precious imports were blocks of lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone that could only be found in the mountains of modern Afghanistan. This gemstone had to travel overland across the Persian plateau, through Mesopotamia, and down to the Levantine coast before it could be loaded onto Tyrian vessels. By the time it reached Knossos, its value had multiplied many times over. Minoan artisans carved the lapis into cylinder seals, beads, and inlays for furniture, creating objects that shimmered with the color of a clear sky. The stone became a symbol of royal status, and its presence on Crete tells us that the Minoan elite had access to trade networks that spanned half the known world. Equally remarkable were the elephant ivory tusks that arrived from the forests of Syria and North Africa. These tusks were carved by Minoan craftsmen into intricate figurines, gaming boards, and decorative panels. The style of these carvings often blended Minoan naturalism with Eastern motifs, such as lions attacking bulls or winged goddesses. This fusion of artistic traditions, known to scholars as Orientalizing, did not happen by accident. It was the direct result of generations of contact between Minoan and Phoenician artisans who worked side by side in the workshops of Knossos and Tyre. The exchange was not limited to raw materials. Phoenician metalworkers taught Minoan smiths new techniques for casting bronze and for granulating gold into fine jewelry. In return, Minoan potters showed their Levantine counterparts how to throw clay on a fast wheel, producing thinner and more elegant vessels. The frescoes themselves tell the story most clearly. On the walls of the palace at Knossos, artists painted scenes of ships with high curved prows and square sails, vessels that look unmistakably like the Phoenician merchant ships of the era. These paintings were not mere decoration. They were a form of royal propaganda, celebrating the wealth and connections that flowed into Knossos via the sea. The Minoan kings wanted everyone who walked through their corridors to see that their power came from the same source as the Phoenician cities: mastery of the ocean. The ships in those frescoes carried more than lapis and ivory. They carried ideas about astronomy, about weights and measures, about the organization of large commercial enterprises. The Minoans absorbed these concepts and adapted them to their own palace economy. The result was a hybrid culture that blended the best of both worlds. This deep cultural exchange shaped the foundations of what would later become European civilization. The Minoan love for luxury goods, their sophisticated trade networks, and their willingness to learn from foreign visitors all passed down to the Mycenaean Greeks who conquered Crete around 1400 before the Common Era. Those Mycenaeans carried the knowledge they gained from Knossos back to the mainland, where it merged with their own traditions. And when the Mycenaean world collapsed, the stories of these ancient voyages survived in epic poetry and in the collective memory of the Greek people. The route from Tyre to Knossos was not just a commercial corridor. It was a bridge between continents, one that allowed the light of the eastern Mediterranean to illuminate the seedbed of Europe. And the frescoes on those palace walls still whisper the names of the sailors who made it possible. Along the Syrian coast, another port city held a different kind of treasure. Aradus, the tiny island city that had already grown rich on the iron trade with the Hittites, sent its ships on a short voyage north to Ugarit, a distance of barely 50 miles. But this was no ordinary route between trading partners. Ugarit was something rare in the ancient world, a city that had mastered not one but two scripts. Its scribes wrote in both Akkadian cuneiform, the complex system of wedge-shaped marks that served as the international language of diplomacy, and in a locally developed alphabetic cuneiform that simplified writing into 30 signs. The city was a hub of record-keeping, a place where merchants, priests, and royal officials documented everything from shipments of grain to treaties with foreign kings. When the ships from Aradus arrived, their crews stepped into a world where knowledge was stored in clay tablets, carefully catalogued and archived in the palace libraries. The trade between the two cities was practical. Aradus sent the cedar timber that Ugarit lacked, along with purple-dyed cloth and glassware. Ugarit sent back linen from its own looms, olive oil from its inland groves, and finely crafted bronze tools. But the cargo that mattered most was invisible. The merchants who traveled this route carried with them administrative techniques that would reshape Phoenician commerce. They studied how the Ugaritic palace organized its accounts, how it tracked imports and exports using standardized weights, and how it managed the flow of goods through its harbor. These methods spread back to Aradus and then to other Phoenician cities. The clay tablets of Ugarit preserved contracts, loans, and partnership agreements that reveal a sophisticated economy based on credit and trust. The Phoenicians learned from this system and adapted it to their own needs, developing one of the most efficient commercial networks of the ancient world. Religious ideas also crossed this short stretch of sea. Ugarit was the spiritual heart of the Canaanite world. Its temples were dedicated to the great gods El, Baal, and Anat, and its priests recited epic poems about the struggles between order and chaos. The myths written down at Ugarit, such as the Baal cycle, share striking similarities with later Phoenician and even biblical texts. When Aradian merchants attended festivals at Ugaritic temples, they absorbed these stories and brought them home. The gods of Ugarit became the gods of Tyre and Sidon, with local names and variations but the same underlying structure of divine kingship and seasonal renewal. Then came the upheaval that reshaped the entire region. Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, Ugarit was destroyed. The exact cause remains uncertain, but the city was burned and never rebuilt. Its libraries collapsed and its clay tablets baked hard in the heat, preserving a snapshot of a civilization in its final moments. The loss was catastrophic for the region. The sophisticated administrative system that had connected the Syrian coast to the empires of Mesopotamia simply vanished. But for the Phoenician cities, the destruction of Ugarit opened a door. With their greatest commercial rival gone, Aradus, Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre stepped into the vacuum. They expanded their trade networks, took over the routes that had once passed through Ugaritic ports, and assumed the role of intermediaries between the eastern interior and the Mediterranean. The administrative lessons they had learned from Ugarit were now applied on a larger scale. The Phoenicians did not just inherit Ugarit's customers, they inherited its methods. The clay tablets that told merchants how to record debts, to standardize weights, and to trust distant partners became the foundation of a commercial empire that would last 1,000 years. The rubble of Ugarit had not ended an era, it had cleared the ground for the Phoenicians to rise. Among the small islands the Phoenicians turned to as their power expanded, none held more strategic value than Malta. This tiny archipelago, sitting almost exactly halfway between Carthage and Sicily, became one of the most important stepping stones in the entire Western Mediterranean. Ships crossing from North Africa to the larger island needed a place to rest, to take on fresh water, and to wait out storms. Malta provided all of that and more. Its deep natural harbors, sheltered by limestone cliffs, could hold dozens of vessels at once. Its fertile soil produced grain, olives, and honey that could provision a fleet for weeks. And its position, commanding the narrow sea lanes between Africa and Europe, made it a natural crossroads for anyone traveling west or east along the North African coast. The Phoenicians did not discover Malta. The island had been inhabited for thousands of years before their arrival by a mysterious people who had built some of the oldest stone temples in the world. These megalithic structures, like the sprawling complex at Rewired, dot above Gantaja on the nearby island of Gozo, were already ancient when the first Phoenician ships sighted the coast. But the newcomers did something the earlier inhabitants had not done on any large scale. They built a permanent harbor city. The site they chose was a deep inlet on the southeast coast, sheltered from the prevailing winds and close to fertile farmland. They called it Maleth, a name that may have meant shelter or safe haven. Later, the Greeks would call it Melite, and the Romans would turn it into the city of Melita, the ancient predecessor of modern Mdina. This harbor became the anchor of the route between Carthage and Sicily. Every season, fleets of round-hulled merchant ships would gather at the docks of Carthage, load their holds with amphorae of wine, oil, and garum, and set sail northeast. After a day and a night at sea, the limestone cliffs of Malta would rise from the horizon. The ships would round the point and glide into the protected waters of the Grand Harbor, where they would tie up at stone quays and unload their cargo into warehouses built into the hillside. Some of these goods were destined for Malta itself. The islanders traded their honey, their woven textiles, and their finely worked stone for the luxuries of Carthage. But most of the cargo was simply in transit, waiting for the next leg of the journey to ports in southern Sicily or the Italian mainland. Malta was a way station in the truest sense, a place where ships could rest, replenish, and reorganize before continuing their voyage. The Phoenicians did not merely use Malta as a transit point, they made it their own. They built temples to their gods on the island, often on sites that had already been sacred for millennia. The largest of these was the sanctuary of Astarte at Tas Silg, a sprawling complex of courtyards and altars that attracted pilgrims from across the central Mediterranean. Here, Phoenician priests offered incense and poured libations to the great goddess of love and war, blending their rituals with the older traditions of the island. The local population, descended from the original temple builders, began to adopt Punic names, Punic dress, and Punic religious practices. They learned to speak the Phoenician language and to write it in the same alphabet that was spreading across the sea. Over the generations, a new culture emerged that was neither wholly Phoenician nor wholly native, but a fusion of both. Scholars call this mixed society Punic civilization, and Malta became one of its most vibrant centers. The island's pottery changed, with new shapes and decorative patterns that blended Levantine and local styles. Its burial customs shifted as families began to lay their dead in rock-cut chambers lined with Phoenician-style inscriptions. Its economy grew more complex as Maltese merchants began to sail their own ships, trading not just with Carthage but with ports in Sicily, Sardinia, and even the coast of Italy. Malta was no longer just a stopping point. It had become a node in the network, a place where goods and ideas from 3 continents met and mingled. The temples that the Phoenicians built there, with their massive stone blocks and their carefully oriented altars, still stand today, a reminder that the small island was never small in its importance. For centuries, every ship that passed between Carthage and Sicily would pause at Malta, and every pause deepened the bonds that tied this little archipelago into the great web of Phoenician commerce. What other islands along the route would receive this same treatment, and how would they shape the civilization that claimed them? Just south of Tyre, along the same stretch of coast, lay a city that was built to be a mirror of its master. Amrit sat on a low promontory where a river met the sea, its natural harbor sheltered by a small island that broke the force of the waves. The city was not large by Phoenician standards, but its position was everything. It guarded the southern approach to Tyre, the last major port before the coastline curved toward the Egyptian frontier. For Tyre to control the southern Levantine trade network, it needed a loyal partner that could receive ships, store goods, and distribute them inland. Amrit was that partner. The route from Tyre to Amrit was a short coastal hop, barely 30 miles as the ship sailed. The journey took half a day with a favorable wind. But those few hours of sailing carried a cargo that represented the pinnacle of Phoenician craftsmanship. Tyrian glass, molten and shaped into translucent vessels that caught the light, was loaded into padded crates in the holds. Alongside it came ingots of metal, bronze that had been alloyed with Cypriot copper and Anatolian tin, and iron that had been forged in the furnaces of the Levant. These were not raw materials, they were finished goods ready for market, the products of Tyre's workshops. When the ships arrived at Amrit, the goods were unloaded onto a long stone quay that extended into the harbor. From there, they moved into the city's warehouses, which lined the waterfront, but Amrit did not simply store these treasures, it redistributed them. The city's own artisans took the raw glass and metal and worked them into local styles, adding decorative motifs that appealed to inland customers. The glass vessels were etched with patterns that blended Phoenician and Egyptian designs, and the metal tools were fitted with handles carved from local wood. This value-added production made Amrit more than a transit point. It made it a center of specialized craftsmanship in its own right. The heart of Amrit was its temple. Built of white limestone on a raised platform overlooking the harbor, the sanctuary was dedicated to a local form of the god Melkart. Pilgrims and merchants alike came to offer prayers for safe voyages and profitable trades. The temple precinct included a sacred pool fed by a freshwater spring, a rarity on this coast, and the water was believed to have purifying powers. Ships arriving from Tyre would often pause at the temple before unloading, their captains leaving small glass beads or metal tokens as offerings. This ritual tied the commercial relationship to the divine, reinforcing the bond between the two cities. Amrit's strategic value lay in its ability to project Tyrian influence southward. Beyond its walls, the coastal plain narrowed against the mountains, and land routes funneled caravans toward the interior. Tyrian merchants who settled in Amrit established permanent trading posts where they exchanged glass and metal for goods from the southern Levant, spices from Arabia, incense from the land of Punt, and slaves from the African interior. These goods were then shipped north to Tyre, where they were re-exported across the Mediterranean. Amrit became the funnel through which the riches of the south flowed into the Phoenician network. The city also served as a military outpost. Its harbor could accommodate war galleys, and its walls were thick enough to withstand a siege. Tyre stationed a small garrison there, not to conquer, but to protect the trade routes from pirates and from the ambitions of rival cities like Sidon. Amrit was the southern shield of Tyre, a place where commerce and defense merged into a single strategy. As long as Amrit remained loyal, Tyre's control over the southern coast was secure. And Amrit remained loyal because its prosperity depended entirely on the trade that flowed through its harbor. The glass and metal that arrived from Tyre fueled its workshops, its markets, and its temple offerings. This symbiotic relationship lasted for centuries. Amrit never challenged Tyre, it complemented it. Together, the two cities created a commercial corridor that extended the reach of Phoenician power deep into the southern Levant. The merchants who walked the streets of Amrit spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, and used the same weights and measures as their counterparts in Tyre. The route between them was not just a line on a map, it was the sinew that connected the heart of Phoenician civilization to its southern limbs. And from that connection, a network of inland trade routes branched outward, carrying Tyrian goods to places no ship could reach. Sidon's ships carried more than cargo to the Egyptian delta. They carried the raw materials that built the monuments of pharaohs and the vessels that explored unknown waters. The route from Sidon southward, hugging the coast past Byblos and the sandy shores of Sinai, led to the 7 mouths of the Nile, where the great river spread into a marshy fan of channels and lagoons. One of the most important destinations was the city of Tanis, a bustling port in the eastern delta that served as a gateway between the Mediterranean and the heart of Egypt. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom and later periods faced a persistent problem. The Nile Valley had plenty of stone and fertile soil, but it lacked good timber. The native acacia and sycamore trees were too small or too twisted for large-scale construction. For roofing massive temple halls, for building seaworthy ships, and for crafting the towering flagpoles that stood before pylons, Egypt needed straight-grained, durable wood. That wood came from the forests of Lebanon, and the city that controlled the best supply was Sidon. Sidonian merchants loaded their holds with logs of cedar and cypress, carefully selected for their length and straightness. They also carried pine resin, used as a preservative and adhesive, and planks of fir for lighter structures. The ships navigated the treacherous delta channels, where sandbars shifted with the current and the water often turned brown with silt. Local Egyptian pilots would board the vessels near the coast to guide them through the maze to Tanis or to the older port of Parameses. Once unloaded, the timber transformed the Egyptian landscape. Cedar beams supported the roofs of the great hypostyle halls at Karnak and Luxor. Cedar planks formed the decks and hulls of the royal barges that sailed the Nile during religious festivals. The pharaohs used this wood not only for practical purposes but as a symbol of their reach. To build with cedar was to announce that Egypt commanded the resources of distant lands. But Sidon provided more than wood. Its shipwrights and sailors possessed knowledge that the Egyptians needed. The pharaohs had long conducted maritime expeditions, most famously to the land of Punt, a mysterious region believed to lie somewhere along the coast of the Horn of Africa or the southern Red Sea. These voyages required ships that could withstand open ocean crossings, ships built to a design that the Egyptians themselves had not fully mastered. So the pharaohs turned to Phoenician expertise. Sidonian navigators were hired to captain and crew Egyptian expeditions. They brought with them the hull designs that had carried them across the Mediterranean, adaptations of the sturdy merchant vessels that could handle rough seas and heavy loads. They knew how to read the stars, how to interpret the behavior of seabirds, and how to find fresh water on arid coasts. For the most famous expedition of all, sent by Queen Hatshepsut to Punt around the 15th century before the Common Era, the ships were almost certainly built with Phoenician methods and guided by Phoenician pilots. The reliefs on Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahri show these ships with high curved prows and square sails, vessels that look strikingly similar to the Phoenician ships depicted on later monuments. The cargo they brought back from Punt included myrrh trees, frankincense, gold, ivory, and exotic animals. This wealth enriched the Egyptian treasury and filled the temple storehouses. But the expedition would not have succeeded without the maritime knowledge that Sidon provided. Over time, the relationship between Sidon and the Egyptian delta deepened into something more than a simple supplier relationship. Phoenician merchants established permanent trading quarters in Tanis and other delta cities. They married into Egyptian families, learned the language, and adapted their business practices to the local bureaucracy. The pharaohs came to rely on them not just for timber but for the entire logistics of overseas trade. When a new temple needed cedar beams, it was Sidon that negotiated the price, arranged the shipment, and ensured the logs arrived before the annual flood. This route made Sidon wealthy and indispensable. Egyptian gold flowed north in payment for timber and expertise. Egyptian linen and papyrus returned south on the same ships. And when the pharaohs looked beyond the Nile toward the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, they knew that the men who could take them there came from the coast of Lebanon. The route from Sidon to the Delta was not just a trade lane, it was a partnership that built the monuments of an empire and opened the door to the farthest reaches of the ancient world. West of Gades, the ocean opened into an unknown world. The Phoenicians had already pushed through the Pillars of Hercules and established their Atlantic outpost at Gades, modern-day Cadiz. But beyond that familiar coast lay a vast expanse of open sea that no Mediterranean sailor had ever dared to cross. Yet scattered across that endless blue, more than 1,000 miles from land, a chain of volcanic islands rises from the depths. The Azores, and there is tantalizing, though not definitive, evidence that Phoenician ships may have reached them. The idea is not as far-fetched as it might sound. The Phoenicians were masters of celestial navigation, able to steer by the stars even when no land was in sight. They knew the patterns of the winds and currents that sweep across the North Atlantic. And they had powerful motivations to sail west. Tin, the essential alloy for bronze, was scarce in the Mediterranean but more abundant in the Atlantic regions. The purple dye that made their fortune came from the murex snail, but related species of marine snails also lived in the waters around the Azores. A successful voyage to those islands could have yielded a fresh source of both the dye and the metal that underpinned their economy. Archaeologists have found very little direct proof. No Phoenician shipwrecks have been discovered near the Azores, no inscriptions carved into the volcanic rock. But there are intriguing hints. In the 18th century, explorers reported finding ancient coins on the island of Corvo, the smallest of the Azores, coins that some claimed were Carthaginian. Those coins have since been lost and the story remains disputed. More recently, researchers have uncovered submerged structures off the coast of Terceira Island that some interpret as ancient harbor works. The most compelling evidence comes from pollen analysis. Cores taken from lake sediments on the Azores show a sudden appearance of certain plant species that are native to the Mediterranean region, appearing around the time the Phoenicians were actively exploring the Atlantic. These plants may have been carried by human hands, perhaps as seeds stuck to clothing or cargo. If Phoenician ships did reach the Azores, the voyage would have been one of the most daring in the ancient world. Sailing from Gades, they would have followed the prevailing winds westward, likely taking a route that curved northward with the currents. The journey would have taken at least a week or more, with no guarantee of finding land. The ships would have carried fresh water in clay jars and dried provisions. The crews would have endured storms, fog, and the psychological strain of watching the horizon for signs of home that never appeared. But if they succeeded, they would have discovered islands rich in bird life, freshwater springs, and forests of juniper and laurel, a true Atlantic paradise. Yet the Azores lacked the one thing that would have made them a permanent colony: metal ores. The islands are volcanic, with no significant deposits of tin or copper. The marine snails that produced purple dye were present, but the waters were colder and less productive than the Mediterranean, so the voyage, if it happened, may have been a one-time expedition. A brave captain pushing the limits of known geography, perhaps searching for islands rumored by sailors blown off course, then returning with stories of green peaks rising from the sea. The knowledge would have been passed down, perhaps recorded in the great libraries of Tyre and Carthage, but never widely shared. The route remained a secret, a lost thread in the fabric of Phoenician exploration. Historians debate the evidence, but the speculation itself reveals something important about the Phoenician character. They were not content with the known world. They pushed outward, driven by the same combination of economic need and restless curiosity that later drove European explorers across the same ocean. The Azores represent the furthest possible reach of their seafaring culture, a line drawn in the Atlantic that would not be crossed again for nearly 2,000 years until Portuguese sailors rediscovered the islands in the 15th century. What those Portuguese found, uninhabited and wild, might have been touched by Phoenician hands a millennium and a half before. The story of that first Atlantic voyage, if it truly happened, remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. And it raises a question that lingers long after the evidence fades. How far did they actually go? The answer to that question may lie in a journey ordered by an Egyptian pharaoh. Around 600 years before the Common Era, a ruler named Pharaoh Necho II sent a fleet of Phoenician sailors on a mission that seemed impossible. He asked them to circumnavigate the entire continent of Africa. The only surviving account of this voyage comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote about it 2 centuries later, and he himself admitted he found the story hard to believe. But the details he recorded are so specific and so strange that many modern scholars think the journey really happened. The Phoenician fleet departed from the Red Sea. They sailed south along the coast of Africa, following the shoreline of what is now Sudan, Eritrea, and Somalia. As they pushed farther, the landscape changed. The familiar deserts gave way to dense forests and the water grew warmer. They landed at intervals to plant grain and wait for the harvest, a practice that allowed them to replenish their food supplies without relying on coastal settlements. This method of slow, deliberate exploration suggests they were prepared for a voyage that would take not weeks but years. The most remarkable part of the story comes when they rounded the southern tip of the continent. Herodotus records that as the Phoenicians sailed westward, the sun appeared on their right side to the north. This seemed absurd to a Greek living in the northern hemisphere, where the sun always moves across the southern sky. But for anyone who has sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, the observation is perfectly accurate. In the southern hemisphere, the midday sun is indeed in the north. That single detail, which Herodotus included because he found it ridiculous, is the strongest evidence that the fleet actually made the passage. After rounding the Cape, the ships continued up the western coast of Africa, past the mouth of the Congo River, past the forests of modern Gabon and Ghana, until they reached the Pillars of Hercules and re-entered the Mediterranean. The entire journey took 3 years. When they finally returned to Egypt, Necho reportedly lost interest in the achievement. He had other priorities, and the route was too long and dangerous to become a regular trade lane. But the knowledge did not disappear. The Phoenician cities, especially Carthage, inherited the navigational secrets of this voyage. The west coast of Africa was now a known quantity. Carthage was the great Western Phoenician power, and it had every reason to exploit that knowledge. The African coast below the Sahara was a source of 3 things that Mediterranean elites craved: gold, ivory, and spices. The gold came from the inland empires of West Africa, carried by rivers to the coast. The ivory was carved from the tusks of forest elephants, larger and more valuable than the Syrian variety. The spices, including a substance called grains of paradise, offered a peppery heat that could transform bland diets. Carthaginian merchants began to sail southward, hugging the coast, establishing seasonal trading posts where they could exchange salt, cloth, and metal tools for the riches of the interior. This contact was not a full-scale colonization. The distances were vast, the climate was harsh, and the local populations were powerful. Instead, the Carthaginians developed a system of silent trade, a practice described by later Greek and Roman authors. The Carthaginians would lay out their goods on a beach, light a signal fire, and then withdraw to their ships. The local traders would come, inspect the merchandise, leave a quantity of gold or ivory beside it, and then retreat. If the Carthaginians judged the amount sufficient, they took it and sailed away. If not, they left the goods and waited for the locals to add more. This form of exchange avoided direct confrontation and allowed commerce to flourish across cultural and linguistic barriers. Over time, the route from Carthage to the Gulf of Guinea region became a quiet but steady pipeline. The gold that reached Carthage was minted into coins that funded its armies. The ivory was carved into statues and jewelry that adorned the homes of the wealthy. The spices added new flavors to Mediterranean cooking, and the contact itself, however limited, represented one of the earliest sustained connections between the peoples of North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. The impact was profound but seldom recorded. There were no great monuments built to commemorate these voyages. The ships came and went with the seasons, their holds filling with the silent wealth of an unseen continent. But the legacy of that route, stretching from the Red Sea around the entire African coast to Carthage, was a map of the possible. It showed that Africa was not a land of mythical monsters but a real place with real resources. And it proved that the Phoenicians, more than any other people of their age, were willing to sail to the very edge of the world and sometimes beyond. What other shores did their restless curiosity reach, and what traces did they leave behind? The dust of the caravan road was a different kind of sea, and the Assyrian kings knew how to navigate it. While Phoenician ships ruled the waves, their most powerful earthly master sat on a throne in the ancient city of Assur, far from the coast and deep in the Mesopotamian interior. The route from Tyre to Assur was not a straight line of water but a winding path of dirt and stone, a road that snaked eastward through the mountains of Lebanon, across the Syrian desert, and down the valley of the Euphrates. It was a journey measured not in days but in weeks, and the cargo it carried was not just for trade, it was for tribute. The Assyrian Empire, at its height, was the most formidable military and political force the Near East had ever seen. Its kings demanded submission from the city-states along the Levantine coast, and they spelled out their demands in stone reliefs and clay tablets. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were expected to send regular shipments of the finest goods they produced: cedar timber for palace roofs and temple doors, gold and silver for the treasury, and the purple-dyed cloth that no desert chieftain could resist. When the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III received tribute from Tyre, the list included gold, silver, linen garments, and precious stones. The cedar beams alone required a massive logistical effort. They were cut in the forests of Lebanon, dragged down to the coast, loaded onto ships for a short voyage north to the mouth of the Orontes River, then transferred onto ox-drawn wagons for the long haul across the plains of Syria. At every stage, Assyrian officials counted and inspected the logs, ensuring that the proper dimensions were met. The tribute was not merely a payment, it was a performance of loyalty. By sending the best of what they had, the Phoenician cities demonstrated their submission to the great king. But this relationship was not one-sided. Assyrian control brought stability to the region. The roads became safer because the empire punished bandits and tax collectors worked under a standardized system. The caravans that left Tyre laden with tribute traveled along routes that were also used by private merchants. They carried not just official goods but also items for sale: Phoenician glass, ivory, and jewelry that found eager buyers among the Assyrian nobility. The capital of Assur and the later capital of Nineveh had lively market quarters where Phoenician traders set up shop, selling luxury items directly to the families of officials and military commanders. In return, these merchants brought back goods from the east: lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, and incense from Arabia. This economic stimulation transformed Phoenicia. The cities grew richer not in spite of paying tribute, but partly because the tribute system forced them to organize their production and transportation at a larger scale. Workshops expanded to meet the demand. Shipbuilders also adapted, learning to construct vessels that could carry heavier loads over longer distances. The Assyrian appetite for luxury goods created a feedback loop. The more the empire demanded, the more the Phoenicians innovated to supply it. and the political control that Assyria exercised over the coastal cities, while real, was often more about receiving a steady flow of wealth than about direct administration. The local kings of Tyre and Sidon remained on their thrones, managing their own affairs as long as the tribute arrived on time. For centuries, this arrangement held. The Assyrian Empire waxed and waned, but the caravans kept moving. Even when Assyrian power collapsed in the late 7th century before the Common Era, the trade routes it had established did not disappear. They were taken over by the next empire, the Babylonians, and then the Persians, each of whom demanded the same cedar and the same purple cloth. The road from Tyre to Assur had become a permanent artery of commerce, one that outlasted the empire that first carved it. And the memory of those heavily laden wagons creaking across the desert under the watchful eyes of Assyrian guards reminds us that Phoenician influence was not limited to the coast. It penetrated the heart of the continent, carried by the steady rhythm of hooves and wheels. What happened when that land route connected to another sea, and the goods of the east began to flow toward a new ocean? The Aegean Sea received those eastern goods, and the city that waited on its shore was Athens. The route from Sidon to the port of Piraeus became one of the most transformative corridors in the ancient world. Sidonian ships arrived with their holds packed full of linen so fine it felt like silk against the skin. They brought papyrus rolls, the paper of the ancient world, without which the great works of Greek philosophy and drama could never have been written down and preserved. And they carried vats of purple dye, the color that would come to symbolize Athenian prestige and power. In exchange, the Athenian merchants loaded the returning ships with jars of golden olive oil, pressed from the groves that covered the hillsides of Attica, and with the red figure pottery that had made their city famous across the Mediterranean. These vases, painted with scenes of gods and athletes, would find their way into the homes of Sidonian nobles, blending Greek artistry with Eastern tastes. But the exchange went far deeper than physical goods. The alphabet that Sidonian merchants used to record their transactions caught the attention of Athenian scribes who saw its potential. They adapted the Phoenician letters, adding symbols for vowel sounds that the original script had never needed, and in doing so created the writing system that would carry the works of Plato and Aristotle down through the centuries. The weights and measures that governed trade in Sidon became the standard in Athenian markets, bringing a new level of fairness and predictability to commerce. And the religious life of Athens was touched by Eastern hands. The cult of Melkart, the great god of Tyre and Sidon, found followers in the city, and his temple became a place where Greek and Phoenician worshippers gathered together. The rituals practiced there, including ceremonial observances that scholars study as part of the complex exchange between these two cultures, introduced new ways of thinking about the divine. These practices did not replace Greek religion but enriched it, adding layers of meaning that would influence Athenian art and literature for generations. The route from Sidon to Athens was not just a trade lane. It was a channel through which the accumulated knowledge of the East poured into the birthplace of Western civilization. And the city that emerged from that exchange was not purely Greek. It was a fusion, a place where the best ideas from two worlds met and multiplied. The Sinai Peninsula was a place of fire and color, where the mountains glowed with veins of turquoise and copper. The route from Byblos to these desolate mines was not a single crossing but a layered journey that blended seamanship with desert endurance. Ships left the cedar-shaded harbor of Byblos and sailed south along the Levantine coast, past the sandy shores of Gaza and into the Gulf of Suez. There, at the Egyptian-controlled port of Ain Sakhna, the cargo was transferred to donkey caravans that struck inland across a landscape of bare rock and shimmering heat. The destination was the Wadi Magher and Serabit el-Qadim, valleys where Egyptian expeditions had toiled for centuries, chipping turquoise from the mountainsides and smelting copper ore in crude furnaces. The Phoenicians did not operate these mines. The pharaohs claimed them as royal property, But the Egyptian expeditions that ventured into Sinai faced a constant problem: lack of supplies. The peninsula had almost no timber for building shelters or fueling fires, and the arid soil could not support vineyards or olive groves, so the pharaohs turned to their trading partners on the Levantine coast. Byblos had long been the primary supplier of cedar for Egypt, and the same relationship extended to the Sinai operations. Phoenician ships arrived at the head of the Gulf of Suez carrying precisely what the expeditions needed: long beams of cedar for constructing temporary buildings and shoring up mine shafts, and amphorae of robust wine that could survive the desert heat without spoiling. In exchange, the Phoenician merchants loaded their holds with the raw products of the mines. Turquoise, a stone the color of a shallow sea, was prized for jewelry and inlay work, and it adorned the finest Egyptian amulets and royal adornments. Copper ingots hammered into flat cakes were equally valuable. This metal had been the backbone of the Bronze Age, and Sinai was one of its earliest sources. The copper from these mines had traveled to Egypt for millennia before the Phoenicians arrived, but the partnership with Byblos made the extraction faster and more reliable. The symbiotic relationship deepened over generations. Egyptian officials stationed at the mines grew accustomed to the regular arrival of Phoenician ships. They allowed the merchants to set up small trading posts near the coast where they could rest, repair their vessels, and wait for favorable winds. In return, the Phoenicians provided not just supplies but also skilled labor. Shipwrights from Byblos helped construct the boats that the Egyptians used to ferry ore across the Gulf, and scribes from the Levantine ports kept records of the copper shipments in the same alphabetic script that was slowly spreading through the region. The mines themselves were grueling places. The heat was oppressive, the water scarce, and the work of chipping stone by hand under the sun would test the endurance of any worker. Yet the turquoise that emerged from those shafts was worth the hardship. It was a stone that seemed to capture the sky itself, and it was reserved for the highest levels of Egyptian society. When a pharaoh wore a necklace of turquoise and gold, he was wearing a piece of the Sinai brought to him by the combined effort of Egyptian miners and Phoenician sailors. This route did more than move minerals. It bound the economies of two civilizations into a single system. Egypt needed the timber and wine that only the Levant could provide, and the Levantine cities needed the access to Egyptian markets that this route granted. The Sinai became a meeting ground, a place where the resources of Africa and Asia blended in the holds of a single ship. The turquoise that sparkled in the tombs of pharaohs and the copper that armed the soldiers of Egypt both carried the invisible mark of Byblos, a city that never mined a single stone but controlled the supply lines that made the mining possible. That partnership, forged in the heat of the desert, would outlast the pharaohs themselves. Carthage understood that the true gate to the Atlantic was not a city but a narrow channel of water. The Strait of Gibraltar, a passage barely 8 miles wide at its narrowest point, connected the Mediterranean Sea to the vast and unknown ocean beyond. And Carthage intended to control that gate completely. From their bases on both sides of the strait, the Carthaginians established a system of monitoring and tolls that rivaled anything the ancient world had ever seen. On the African side, the city of Tingis, modern Tyre, stood watch. On the European side, the fortress of Gades, ancient Cadiz, served as the western anchor of this maritime checkpoint. Every ship that attempted to pass through the strait had to sail within sight of Carthaginian lookouts, who signaled to patrol vessels that could intercept any vessel that tried to slip through without paying. The tolls were not arbitrary. They were calculated based on the size of the ship and the value of its cargo. A small fishing boat paid a modest fee, perhaps a jar of oil or a basket of dried fish. A merchant vessel laden with Iberian silver or African ivory paid a percentage of its worth, a tax that could amount to a small fortune. The Carthaginians justified these fees as payment for the maintenance of the lighthouses. the beacons that guided ships through the dangerous currents, and the pilots who could navigate the tricky waters where the Atlantic met the Mediterranean. In reality, the tolls were simply the price of access to the only route between two worlds. The genius of this system lay in its natural advantage. The strait was a bottleneck, a narrow corridor that no ship could bypass. The winds and currents funneled all traffic through the same channel, and the Carthaginians had positioned their patrol vessels to exploit this inevitability. A ship trying to run the gauntlet without stopping would face not only the risk of interception, but also the danger of the shallow waters and hidden rocks that line the coast. The local pilots, all loyal to Carthage, knew every hazard. An unauthorized vessel might find itself grounded on a sandbar with its hull shattered, its cargo lost to the waves and the waiting Carthaginian salvage crews. This control rested on a foundation deeper than military power. It rested on religion. The Carthaginians called the rocky promontories on either side of the strait the Pillars of Melkart, named after their greatest god. Melkart, whose name meant king of the city, was the patron deity of Tyre and the protector of Phoenician sailors. The Carthaginians, as the western descendants of Tyre, claimed that Melkart had placed these pillars as markers of his domain. To pass between them was to enter sacred territory, and the tolls paid were offerings to the god. This religious framing transformed what might have been seen as extortion into a pious act. The crews who paid the fee were not merely buying safe passage, they were honoring the god who watched over the sea. Temples to Melkart stood on both sides of the strait, and ship captains would stop to make offerings before or after the crossing. The priests of these temples kept detailed records of the ships that passed, the cargoes they carried, and the tolls they paid, effectively maintaining a census of all Atlantic commerce. The monopoly brought immense wealth to Carthage. The silver that flowed from Iberia, the tin from the Cassiterides, the gold from West Africa, and the ivory from the interior all had to pass through the Pillars of Melkart. A portion of every shipment stayed in Carthaginian hands. The city used this revenue to build its fleet, to pay its mercenaries, and to finance the grand public works that made it the jewel of North Africa. The harbor of Carthage, with its double basins and its dry docks capable of holding 200 warships, was built with the proceeds of the strait tolls. The walls of the city, said to be strong enough to repel any army, were financed by the steady stream of coins that flowed from the gatekeepers of the Atlantic. But this monopoly came with a long-term cost. The control of the strait made Carthage a target. Other powers, especially the rising Roman Republic, watched Carthaginian wealth with envy and resentment. The Romans understood that to break Carthage, they would need to break its grip on the western sea lanes. The First Punic War, fought over control of Sicily, was in part a struggle to gain access to the routes that led to the Atlantic. When Rome finally defeated Carthage in the Third Punic War and razed the city to the ground in the year 146 before the Common Era, one of its first acts was to take control of the strait. The Romans understood perfectly that the gate to the Atlantic was the key to the wealth of the West, and so the Pillars of Melkart became the Pillars of Hercules, renamed but still standing as silent witnesses to the power of maritime control. The legacy of that Carthaginian monopoly did not end with Rome. It set a pattern that would be repeated for millennia. Every empire that sought to control the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, from the Romans to the Moors to the Spanish, learned the same lesson that Carthage had taught. The strait was not just a passage, it was a prize, and the ones who held the prize could tax the world. The desert east of the Nile held a secret that connected two oceans. While Carthage controlled the gate to the Atlantic, the older Phoenician cities looked toward a different body of water, one that led to the spices of Arabia and the gold of Africa. The route from Tyre to the Red Sea was not a single sea lane, but a carefully orchestrated combination of coastal sailing and overland travel that bridged the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. Ships left the harbor of Tyre and sailed south, hugging the coast past the sandy shores of the Sinai Peninsula. At the head of the Gulf of Aqaba, they reached the port of Elath, a small but vital settlement that served as the gateway to the Eastern Sea. Here, the cargo was unloaded and transferred to caravans that struck eastward across the arid landscape toward the Red Sea coast. The journey was grueling, requiring weeks of travel under a relentless sun, but the rewards were worth every step. From the ports of the Red Sea, Phoenician merchants gained access to the trade networks that stretched across the Arabian Peninsula and into the Indian Ocean. The frankincense and myrrh that perfumed the temples of the Mediterranean came from the hills of southern Arabia, carried by camel caravans to the coast. The cinnamon and cassia that flavored the dishes of the wealthy arrived from the distant shores of India and Southeast Asia, and the gold that glittered in the treasuries of Tyre came from the mines of Nubia and the interior of Africa, shipped down the Nile and then across the desert to the Red Sea. This route required careful organization and the cooperation of multiple intermediaries. The Phoenicians did not sail directly to India. They traded with the peoples who controlled the Arabian coast, the Sabaeans and the Himyarites, who themselves were masters of the monsoon winds. The relationship was built on trust and mutual benefit. The Phoenicians provided what the Arabs could not produce in quantity: fine pottery, glass vessels, and the purple dye that was prized across the East. In return, the Arab merchants loaded the ships with sacks of frankincense tears, bundles of cinnamon bark, and ingots of gold. The impact of this route on the Mediterranean world was profound. The spices and incense that flowed through Tyre transformed cooking, medicine, and religious practice. The gold strengthened the economies of the Levantine cities and funded the construction of temples and harbors. And the knowledge of the monsoon winds, passed from Arab sailors to Phoenician captains, would later be inherited by the Greeks and Romans. When the Nabateans rose to power in the centuries after the Phoenician peak, they built their own trading empire on the same foundation, controlling the overland routes that connected the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. The city of Petra, carved from rose-red stone, became the new hub for this commerce, but the routes themselves were the ones the Phoenicians had pioneered. And when Rome eventually conquered the region, it inherited a system that had been tested and refined for more than 1,000 years. The incense burners of Roman temples, the pepper on Roman tables, and the gold in Roman treasuries all traced their origins back to that slender corridor between Tyre and the Red Sea. It was a route that did not just move goods, it moved the entire axis of ancient trade, linking the markets of the Mediterranean to the riches of the East. And the Phoenicians, with their ships and their caravans, were the ones who first forged that link. The forests of Cilicia stood waiting, their timber destined for Phoenician shipyards. The route from Sidon to Tarsus began as a coastal voyage northward, past the mouth of the Orontes River and into the Gulf of Issus. There, the Taurus Mountains swept down to the sea, their slopes covered in dense groves of fir and pine that had never been touched by Phoenician axes. Tarsus itself sat on the banks of the Cydnus River, a few miles inland from the coast, where the clear mountain water provided a natural harbor for shallow draft vessels. The city was the gateway to Cilicia, a region that Mediterranean sailors had long recognized as a treasure house of raw materials. The timber that grew on those mountain slopes was among the finest in the ancient world. Straight-grained and resilient, it was ideal for the planks that formed the hulls of merchant ships and the masts that carried their sails. Phoenician shipwrights prized Cilician wood above almost all others, and they sent regular expeditions to Tarsus to select the best logs. The iron that came from the same region was equally valuable. The mountains of Cilicia held deposits that had been worked since the time of the Hittites, and the metal that emerged from their furnaces was strong and pure. Phoenician blacksmiths forged this iron into the nails, fittings, and tools that held their ships together and kept their fleets operating. The route to Tarsus was a short and reliable one. A ship could make the journey from Sidon in 3 days with a favorable wind. following the coast past the Lebanese mountains and into the open waters of the northeast corner of the Mediterranean. The approach to Tarsus required careful navigation as the Cydnus River shifted its course with the seasons, but local pilots knew the channels and guided the vessels safely to the unloading docks. This steady traffic transformed Tarsus from a modest Cilician town into a bustling commercial hub. Its markets filled with Phoenician glass and purple cloth, and its warehouses overflowed with timber and iron waiting to be shipped south. But the real transformation came when the Persian Empire conquered the region. The Achaemenid kings saw the value of this corridor immediately. They built a branch of the Royal Road, their great highway system, that passed directly through Tarsus and connected it to the heart of the empire. This road stretched eastward across Anatolia through the Cilician Gates, a narrow pass carved through the Taurus Mountains, and then down into the plains of Mesopotamia. A message or a merchant could travel from Tarsus to the Persian capital of Susa in a matter of weeks, a journey that would have taken months by sea. The integration was seamless. Phoenician goods that arrived by ship in Tarsus were loaded onto the waiting caravans of the Royal Road, where they traveled eastward to markets in Babylon, Ecbatana, and Persepolis. The purple dye of Sidon, the glass of Tyre, and the cedar of Byblos became familiar sights in the bazaars of the Persian heartland. In return, the caravans brought back goods that the Phoenician cities had never seen in such quantity: lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan, carnelian from the Indus Valley, and fine textiles woven in the workshops of Susa. This connection did more than expand the range of goods available in Phoenician markets. It tied the fate of the coastal cities to the stability of an empire that stretched from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. The Achaemenids, for their part, recognized the value of their Phoenician subjects. They allowed the cities to maintain their local kings, their customs, and most importantly, their fleets. Phoenician ships formed the backbone of the Persian navy, and Phoenician merchants served as the empire's commercial agents in the Mediterranean. The route from Sidon to Tarsus became the hinge that joined two worlds. It connected the sea routes of the Mediterranean to the land routes of Asia, allowing Phoenician enterprise to reach farther east than any previous generation had ever thought possible. And when the Persian Empire eventually fell to Alexander the Great, the roads that its kings had built did not disappear. The Royal Road remained a vital artery of commerce, used by the Hellenistic kingdoms and later by the Romans. The timber and iron of Cilicia continued to flow southward, and the goods of the east continued to pass through Tarsus. The legacy of that route, forged by Phoenician merchants and Persian administrators, survived the fall of both empires. It was a reminder that the most enduring roads are not built by conquerors alone, but by the steady rhythm of trade that outlasts every dynasty. The Atlantic coast of Africa held a secret that Carthage was determined to unlock. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the shoreline stretched southward into a realm of shifting sand and unknown waters. No Mediterranean power had ever dared to explore it systematically. But around the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era, a Carthaginian admiral named Hanno the Navigator gathered a fleet of 60 ships and set out to change that. His expedition carried 30,000 settlers, men and women chosen to establish permanent trading posts along the coast. The ships were loaded with the goods that Carthage produced best: amphorae of purple dye extracted from murex snails, blocks of salt harvested from the Balearic Islands, and stacks of fine pottery painted with geometric patterns. These were the currency of exchange, the items that Mediterranean traders knew would attract the attention of communities living along the African shore. Hanno's fleet sailed south, hugging the coast, stopping at intervals to plant colonies. The first major settlement was at a place he called Thymiaterion, probably near modern Mahdia in Morocco. Then farther south, at the mouth of the Cebu River, he founded a second colony. Each outpost was built with defensive walls, storehouses, and a small harbor where ships could be repaired. The settlers planted crops and dug wells, creating self-sufficient communities that could survive without constant resupply from Carthage. As the fleet pressed deeper into unknown waters, the landscape changed. The green hills of Morocco gave way to the brown emptiness of the Western Sahara. The crew saw vast herds of animals they had never encountered: elephants, rhinoceroses, and strange antelopes. They also saw fires burning on the hillsides, signal fires set by the local inhabitants who watched the ships from a distance. Hanno recorded that his interpreters could not understand the languages spoken by these people. The fleet pushed on until it reached an island in a large gulf, which modern scholars identify as the island of Arguin off the coast of Mauritania. There, Hanno established his farthest colony, a settlement he called Cerne. This was the southernmost point of the expedition, a base from which Carthaginian merchants could trade with the peoples of the interior. The goods that came back from this region were unlike anything that reached Carthage through other routes. The local inhabitants brought gold, not in coins but in raw nuggets and dust panned from the rivers that flowed down from the highlands of West Africa. They brought elephant ivory carved into rough blocks or left as whole tusks. They offered hides of exotic animals, lion skins, and leopard pelts that would be turned into ceremonial garments and shields. And they traded with the Carthaginians using a system of silent exchange similar to what earlier travelers had described. The Carthaginians would lay out their purple dye, their salt, and their pottery on a beach, light a signal fire, and then retreat to their ships. The local traders would come forward, inspect the goods, and leave a pile of gold or ivory beside them. If the Carthaginians judged the quantity sufficient, they took it and sailed away. If not, they left the goods on the beach and withdrew again, waiting for the local traders to add more. This method avoided direct contact and allowed commerce to flourish across a barrier of language and suspicion. The gold that reached Carthage through this route transformed the city's economy. It was minted into coins that bore the image of the goddess Tanit and the head of a horse, coins that became the standard currency of the Western Mediterranean. The ivory was carved into statues and furniture that adorned the homes of the Carthaginian elite. The hides were tanned and dyed, then sold to markets in Greece and Italy. Hanno's expedition was not just a voyage of exploration. It was a deliberate act of economic expansion, a strategy to open a new frontier for Carthaginian commerce. The trading posts he established became the southern anchors of a network that stretched from the shores of West Africa to the ports of the Levant. For more than a century, Cerne and the other colonies functioned as gateways, funneling the wealth of the African interior into the Carthaginian treasury. The route itself was dangerous and long. The winds along the coast were unpredictable, and the currents could push a ship onto hidden shoals. The heat was oppressive and fresh water was scarce. But the profits were enormous. A single shipment of African gold could finance a year of naval operations or build a temple that would stand for centuries. The knowledge that Hanno brought back to Carthage, recorded on a tablet that was displayed in the temple of Baal Hamon, became a prized possession. It told the story of a continent that was not a land of myth but a place of real resources and potential trading partners. It showed that the African coast was not an endless wall of desert but a series of ecological zones, each with its own products and its own peoples. And it proved that Carthage, the daughter of Tyre, had the courage and the skill to venture where no other Mediterranean power had gone before. The route from Carthage to the Atlantic coast of Africa remained active for centuries, long after Hanno himself had passed into legend. It connected the Mediterranean world to the gold fields of the Senegal and Niger rivers, to the forests of the Ivory Coast, and to the savannas where elephants roamed in herds. It was a corridor of commerce that opened West Africa to the wider world, and it did so without the violence of conquest. The Carthaginians traded, they established outposts, and they left when the exchange was done. The legacy of that route would outlast Carthage itself. When the Roman Empire absorbed North Africa, the trade with West Africa did not stop. It continued, adapted, and eventually passed into the hands of Arab merchants who followed the same coastline centuries later. The gold that had once filled Carthaginian treasuries eventually filled the coffers of the Islamic caliphates, and the memory of Hanno's fleet, 60 ships sailing into the unknown, remained as a testament to the reach of Phoenician ambition. That ambition did not end at the Pillars of Hercules. It pushed beyond into a world of fire and gold, and it changed the course of history. The Etruscan cities of central Italy beckoned Tyrian ships with a different kind of wealth. These were not ports exchanging raw metals or timber, but sophisticated hilltop towns of a people who shared something unexpected with the Phoenicians. They were neither Greek nor Roman, and they resisted full assimilation into either culture. The route from Tyre to the Tyrrhenian coast stretched nearly 2,000 miles, a long haul that required careful planning and a network of friendly harbors along the way. Ships sailed west past Cyprus and Crete, then followed the southern coast of Sicily, where Phoenician trading posts offered shelter and supplies. From there, they crossed the Tyrrhenian Sea to the ports of Populonia and Tyre, the main gateways to the Etruscan homeland. Tyrian merchants brought what they always carried: purple-dyed fabrics that shimmered in the Italian sun, glass beads and vessels that captured light, carved ivory plaques, and jewelry of astonishing intricacy. These luxury goods found a ready market among Etruscan nobles, who displayed them in their tombs and decorated their houses with Phoenician motifs. But the most valuable cargo was one that left no physical trace in the ground. The alphabet. Etruscan scribes had no native writing system of their own before contact with the Phoenicians. They borrowed the letters directly, adapting them to the sounds of their own language. The earliest Etruscan inscriptions date to around 700 before the Common Era, and they are written in a script that is unmistakably derived from the Phoenician alphabet. The letters were reshaped slightly, and some were added to represent sounds that did not exist in Semitic speech, but the core remained. When the Romans later adopted their own alphabet, they took it from the Etruscans, not directly from the Greeks. That means the letters we use today, A, B, C, D, trace their ancestry back through Etruscan hands to the Phoenician ports of the Levant. The artistic exchange was equally deep. Etruscan craftsmen studied the animal motifs and geometric patterns on Phoenician metal bowls and began to incorporate them into their own bronze work. The famous Etruscan mirrors, engraved with scenes from mythology, show stylistic elements that first appeared on Phoenician ivories. Even the way Etruscan temples were decorated, with brightly painted terracotta tiles and elaborate roof ornaments, echoes the architectural traditions of the Eastern Mediterranean. This trade forged a bond between two cultures that were both outsiders in the Greek-dominated world. The Etruscans and the Phoenicians shared a mutual suspicion of Greek expansion, and they sometimes allied against common enemies. At sea, Etruscan pirates and Phoenician merchant ships learned to cooperate rather than compete. On land, Etruscan kings welcomed Tyrian traders into their courts, granting them privileges and protection. The relationship was not one of domination, but of mutual respect between commercial empires. The Etruscans gave the Phoenicians access to the mineral wealth of central Italy: iron from the island of Elba, copper from the mountains of Tuscany, and silver from the mines of Volterra. In return, the Phoenicians provided the finished goods and the written language that helped Etruscan civilization flourish. When the Etruscans eventually faded under Roman pressure, their alphabet and their artistic heritage did not disappear. The Romans absorbed both, and through them, the Phoenician influence on Italy became permanent. The route from Tyre to Etruria was not just a trade lane, it was a channel that carried the seeds of Latin literature, Roman law, and the Western alphabet itself. And it all began with ships that sailed west, carrying purple cloth and glass beads, and the quiet revolution of written words. Those 30 routes wove a web that held the ancient world together. They were not the arteries of a single empire, but the invisible threads that connected dozens of cultures across 3 continents. From the cedar forests of Lebanon to the gold fields of West Africa, from the tin islands of the Atlantic to the spice ports of the Red Sea, Phoenician ships and caravans carried more than cargo. They carried the raw materials of civilization itself. The alphabet that began as a simple tool for recording trade accounts on the docks of Byblos and Sidon became the script that wrote the works of Homer, the laws of Rome, and the words we are speaking right now. Religious ideas, from the worship of Melkart to the temples of Astarte, blended with local traditions and left lasting echoes in the faiths of later peoples. The purple dye that colored the robes of kings became a symbol of power that would endure for thousands of years. The agricultural knowledge that turned the hills of Sicily into orchards and vineyards fed populations that would grow into great cities. And the routes themselves, the sea lanes and overland corridors that the Phoenicians pioneered, became the foundations upon which later empires built their own networks. The Greeks followed those same paths to colonize the Mediterranean. The Romans inherited the system of harbors, lighthouses, and standardized weights that made long-distance commerce possible. The Persians used the land routes that connected the Levant to the heart of Asia. Even the great trade roads of the Islamic Golden Age traced their roots back to Phoenician caravans. The Phoenicians never sought to rule the world through armies or governors. They ruled it through connections. They were the glue that held the ancient world together, the intermediaries who made sure that the gold of Africa reached the temples of Greece, that the tin of Britain reached the bronze workshops of Mesopotamia, and that the ideas of the East reached the minds of the West. Their legacy is not carved in stone monuments or inscribed in conquests. It is woven into the fabric of how we live today. The global economy, with its sprawling networks of ships and satellites, its interconnected markets and its constant exchange of goods and ideas, is a direct descendant of those 30 routes. The spirit of the Phoenician sailor, who looked at the horizon and saw opportunity instead of emptiness, still moves the world. If you enjoyed this journey through the trade routes that shaped civilization, consider exploring more of the ancient world's hidden stories on this channel.